Welcome back. It's been 7 days since I sat before this camera. A lot has happened in the world. A lot has happened between my ears and thinking about where I am and where I'm going. And I admit to you that I don't always look at the stats from the viewing of the various venues that we have, whether it's Facebook or YouTube. I don't think anybody really looks at my Vimeo account where everything is stored. But I actually did last week. I went back, for whatever reason, I stumbled onto the YouTube viewing. And that has shaped my thinking and my preparation for our time together this week. My principal venue is Facebook because that's where many of you know me. We have a relationship in the past, and that's the primary social media connection, and I'm grateful for that, and so stuff gets posted there. And then for those few people who have written Facebook off or have never been a part of it, YouTube is like the video world for most of the planet. And so I post things there. And up until the last few weeks, I'd had one or two or maybe three people go to YouTube and watch what was posted there. And very rarely does anybody actually make a comment. I can count on Mike Fahey, who I've talked about before in Minnesota, to watch it there and then to comment on it, and I'm grateful for that, for the relationship, for his words of encouragement and support, and his support of our ministry. And it was really in respect to that, because those of you who have been following with me now for any length of time know that we've been on a journey. We spent a lot of time talking about church revitalization, the opportunities I have to speak at churches, and I video that and then bring that and present that here. And then because of my own interest in the thinking process of other people in a faith journey, that we took sort of a detour. I want to refer to those as field trips. We don't chase rabbits, those are field trips, because they're excursions to understand, to read, to gain new insight, and then to be able to collate that information and share it here. And for that reason, we moved into what we referred to as talking about and looking at modern day spiritual, religious deconstructionism. And I admit that up until the last probably 6 months or so, I wasn't immersed in all that implied or meant, or even the history of it. And because of my relationships with some people and the reading that I do, I come across an idea, or I watch a lot of YouTube as well, debates and conversations and teaching. I don't do preachers. We're a strange lot, and so very few guys am I interested in hearing what they have to say. So exchanges that people have, because then it requires a certain thinking ability in the moment to be able to answer questions specifically. So whether it's a conversation or whether it's a debate, we've done that. And having said that, then I shared with you recently last week, the reading for the week was this book here called Dethroning Jesus. It was recommended to me by Ben Phillips, who's the chairman of the Dean of the Department of Religious Studies at Charleston Southern University, where I now have a growing number of friends. And I'm grateful for that academic community and my relationships there, my continuing growing relationships. It's even extended into the Department of Chemistry now. The chair of the Department of Chemistry is now a friend of mine that we shared lunch, because he has an interest in the same thing, even though his background is biology and the sciences, because he's a person on his own spiritual journey. And he's in a discipline to where many in let's say the non-religious culture don't put a lot of stock in spiritual values, or things that can't be seen with a microscope or viewed with a telescope, or somehow put under a lab experimentation as whether it's true or not. But anyway, it's been a joy to have these conversations and see how broad some of these subject matters are with people. So I read this, and it was there that I gained probably a better understanding of what deconstruction is. The fact that somebody who has confessed a sort of a New Testament faith relationship with Jesus as the Messiah, whose death on the cross was an atonement for sin, who literally came back to life, and who ascended back to heaven and will come again to someday, based on what the Scripture has to say about him. And people who have embraced that and even lived that, or even preached that, or even taught that, or written about that somewhere along the way, things changed for them. They began entertaining questions that they had never entertained before, and they weren't able to hear or receive adequate explanation. And so they concluded that there was nothing to that which they had believed before. And literally their faith had been deconstructed. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of those began with an assumed faith that simply extended itself into the environment they were in, the context, the people they were around, and they simply affirmed those things. And so their deconstruction journey was very different. Which brings me to this, and in the time allotted, and I have to confess to you that without any written notes in front of me, how quickly our time evaporates. 40 minutes is gone like in a heartbeat, because I have so much going on in my mind and my heart to share with you, that I realize in this framework that, everything is on something of a continuum. All subject matter is on something of a continuum, with not everyone at the same point on that. And sometimes I'm challenged as whether you have a continuum that starts with 0 on this end and then goes all the way down to whatever the value is you want to put on the far end. Or I'm thinking perhaps this one is you put 0 in the middle so that on this side it is less than anything, and on this side it is something more. So I'm not really sure which way to put it, other than if we take even our dating, our calendar. It's based on a time frame. Let's put it, a time frame for the birth of Christ. BC, AD revolved around the influence of Christianity on the world as the calendar moved from an Old Testament model or a Jewish model to sort of a Roman model, and we have that influence there. So you start with a 0 timeline there. You have BC, and then you have AD. The same may be true here, and I'll leave the jury out on that. But I do realize that there are people who, perhaps even some of you who watch this, that you began life not only not knowing anything, but had them been raised in an environment when it came to the context of Scripture, the Bible, what the Bible has to say, evangelical Christian values and interpretations, that was not on the radar. It wasn't a part of your world or the world of your parents. And so not only did you not know anything, did they not know anything, they didn't even suspect anything. So whether that's on the minus end of a spectrum with a 0 in the middle, or whether that's at the baseline of 0, which I'm inclined to do that. And so you start there. And for you, or for those people, when they come to the first exposure to the content of the Bible as we know it, the 66 books of what we call the canon of Bible, 27 in the New Testament, 39 in the Old Testament, that you read it, or they read it, through eyes that are by and large unbiased, unless somebody has spoken into it in a contrary manner. So if you don't know anything, you don't suspect anything, and you come across this and you read it, you're going to read it with curiosity, not really sure what it's all about, and so your conclusions about it are going to be uniquely your own, and that probably represents the largest part of the people who live on planet Earth, under the billions of people that are here. Most people have no idea about the gospel. And then you have those people on that continuum that are not at 0, a blank, but they're born into an environment where at least that information is available. It's a part of history, it's a part of the culture, it's part of tradition in some form or fashion. And that can be very much all over the map. It's different from being born, and I'm learned, like in South Africa, since apartheid, that it is considered very much a Christian nation, and that everybody that was born in the last 40 years there, they were exposed to it, they heard it. Or whether it's in a place like England, where if you were born as an Englishman, you were born into the Anglican Church. You didn't have a choice. It's how you started out. And so you were put into that stream of the Bible based on an Anglican interpretation, for better or for worse. And so that's become a part of your worldview. And then it can be somewhere as far as, say, fundamentalism in America, where people not only are born into an environment where that's part and parcel of the information they have and their worldview, but it carries with it some extreme biases about, how things should be read and interpreted. And you start, and I would put those down, somewhere, not on the far end, but somewhere down on this end of midway. More than just a casual, more than just a nominal influence, but actually almost an indoctrination. We're not going to call that a brainwashing, but a heavy indoctrination. And then you move beyond that, which could be people from all the way down here at any point along the way, to where they're aware of all that information, they've been exposed to all that information, and they don't know what to make of it. You don't know whether it's true or not true. You're curious about it. You hear what people say. You watch the debates. You hear the conversations. And you're not even sure that there really is a God. And so you would fit into the category of an agnostic, those who do not know. Now, interestingly enough, the agnostic category is really born out of a category that was in like 1st and 2nd century Christianity, a group of people that were known as the Gnostics. The Gnostics believed that the way that you knew God was through a special knowledge that not just everybody had. You were either an insider or an outsider, and the way to know God was through this special knowledge. So an agnostic would be someone that doesn't have a special knowledge. They just have uncertainty about all the information of the data they receive. And then you have beyond that, you have people who have come to the conclusion, either they started at this point and they didn't move from this, they didn't know anything, they didn't believe anything, and so the people of this category include those that don't believe there is a God. They have no reason to believe there's a God. They've seen no evidence there's a God, and so they've come to a conclusion that there is no God. And for them, they're pretty much indifferent or neutral in terms of what other people believe or think, and they're okay with that. You believe what you want to believe, I'll believe what I want to believe, and we'll get along somehow if we can agree on what is right and wrong in the meantime. And then the far end of that, way down here, is you would have the rabid, the militant atheist. And they're not content to believe that there is no God, but they don't think anybody else should believe that there is a God. And so it is in their desire and design and plans and purposes to not only not believe, but to try to destroy the faith of everybody else, wherever they happen to be along this spectrum, because they think it's absolutely foolishness to believe that. And so what happened a few weeks ago when we began dealing with this, that I saw the viewing numbers of the people who logged on to watch the videos when we talked about deconstructionism, they took a spike. 20 and 30 times more people viewed those videos than were viewing everything else that I had done. And I was pleasantly surprised at that spike. Only a couple people actually made comments about it, but the fact that people were curious, I know they queried on the YouTube search and whether it was deconstructionism or some other word that I used in that led them to watch a part, if not all, of the videos. And so I've recognized that. Now last week, because of what's going on in our world in respect to Israel, anti-Semitism, I felt the need to go and address that in this framework. But this was never far from my mind. So having finished Dethrone Jesus, and one of the YouTube video I watched mentioned this book here. It's the heresy of orthodoxy. Because what I have discovered is that before there is deconstruction of spiritual values, truths believed in respect to what the Bible says, there was first a reconstruction, where somebody took those things that many of us in Western civilization were raised in the framework of a belief in the Bible, not necessarily being a Christian nation, but certainly one heavily influenced by Bible believers, whether they're historical figures or not. That very much was ingrained in the laws and the codes and the morals of our country. And most of us grew up under those influences. And so that's the one that we inherited, which was the one that had been constructed. It had been constructed on a belief in the integrity of the 66 books of the Bible, with some debate and argument over the translations. We get that. And yet there was general consensus that those things were true. Now, I have to confess that having been in ministry I've been preaching almost 50 years and doing pastoral work, ministry more than 40 years, Then I realized that most of the people that speak about these things don't necessarily qualify in their opinion. I'm convinced there are more people who say they believe the Bible than have actually ever read any of it. They simply assume, they trust the people they heard that from, they're okay with the things they believe about it. It's simply not that important to explore any longer. To those who've read a little bit, portions of it, but they've never read it in its entirety. And then there are those that, on the other end, who actually make it a part of their daily lives. They read every day. For some of us, the goal is to read it through at least once a year because there's so much there, and for us to be able to collate all that information in a reasonable fashion, unless we're content to have somebody else do our thinking for us. And so we're all over in the map with this. And I'm reasonably convinced that both, certainly the militant atheists, they've actually read it. They perhaps have read all of it, but they've read it with a very biased view that there's no truth in this. I'm just simply reading this so I know what's there. So when I go to critique it, I can cite instances where I have a problem with it. So that's sort of all background today. And if I was to title this, it would be Deconstruction and Reconstruction, the whole story. So let me just begin by reading our text today. This is out of Galatians chapter 1, where the Apostle Paul, and this is one of many places where there's a reference to the tension that existed that became known as Reconstructionism. Galatians chapter 1. Paul writes, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. So without knowing who you are that's watching this, I don't know where you are on that spectrum. Some of you, because I know you personally, I have some idea. I was a part of that journey, either introducing you to the truth of the gospel and the person of Christ that you responded to, and you experienced what you experienced, and you embraced what you embraced, and it's changed your life forever. You will never be the person you were before because it is ingrained in who you are, because you believe it. You have no reason to doubt it. And so for those of that don't fit into that category, you would say, I have more question marks about the merits of it, the value of it, or the integrity of it, then I guess maybe I'm wanting to speak to you. Because in my reading these books, to go back and understand history, I'm a person who loves history, that in most systems of belief and faith, there's a story, there's a historical line behind why things unfolded the way that they did. And while deconstructionism is to go back and dismantle a system and a structure and content, reconstruction is to go back and reorder that first. And Paul actually makes a reference here, which, if you subscribe to the fact that Paul was a first century person, that he was, as described in the book of Acts, a Pharisee, which he was among the religious Jews, and that he was an enemy, an opponent of this message, this itinerant preacher in his day that was embracing his identity as the promised Messiah of Old Testament history, and that he, the claim was by his disciples that he was crucified and they came back to life, and then 40 days later he ascended to heaven, and they're looking for him to come back. But if you're a Paul in that first century, you don't subscribe to that because it doesn't fit into your Jewish narrative, Old Testament as you understand it, then you're offended by that and you go about to actually destroy that. And as is recorded in the book of Acts, it depends on whether you believe that is historically sufficient or not, that he had an encounter with the Jesus that he denied being the Messiah. He had a conversion experience, and so he went from being an enemy of Jesus to being a preacher of Jesus. And that was the rest of his story. And so when we read through what are known as the Pauline letters or the Pauline epistles, in conjunction with the overlay of the book of Acts, which is sort of a historical timeline of the birth and movement of the church in the first century, then we're left to either believe or not believe that what he writes is true. But if we take this account in Galatians, which was one of the places that he went and planted a church, and he started a church, he raised up leadership, he'd pass the leadership off, and then he'd move on. And he'd either circle back around and see them again, or he would write a letter should he not be able to go. And so he wrote what we know as 13 letters or 13 epistles. And in there he describes many times that after he had been somewhere and preached the gospel as he knew it, somebody else came along and said, well, that's not the whole story. There's more to this than in what he told. And quite often they will say he was not really qualified to be speaking to this. He didn't tell you what you needed to know. Let us elaborate, let us flesh that out to you. And so in this passage, he even acknowledges that there are those who come along and actually do this. And again, as you read through, you see the challenge in what constitutes this reconstruction are those who have come along now in 2,000 years later, sometimes within that time frame primarily, and it's come back and said, well, we can't rely on those accounts. We can't rely on the credibility of what is known as the letter to the Galatians. We can't rely on the fact that it is believed that Paul actually wrote these things. And so they start backing up and say, we have looked at the evidence. We've looked at the manuscript evidence, we looked at the document evidence, we looked at the history, we've looked at extra biblical sources, and we've come to the conclusion that what has been believed about the Bible, the New Testament in particular, the Gospels and the epistles, that we have been wrong and others have been wrong. And that there's not sufficient evidence to believe that either the people who they said under the name of actually wrote those, or that they were actually written during that first century in the timeline of those original apostles who followed Jesus and who were part of the birth and the growth of the church. Simply stated, it's people of probably the last century that have raised the doubts and the suspicion, and because of that, they reconstructed what they think is true. And what they think is true is that there was more than one gospel. Okay, well, the Apostle Paul admits that even in his time, if you're talking about in the 20 or 30 years following the time that Jesus walked this earth before going back to heaven, that there were other people who came along and said, well, that was his gospel, this is our gospel. And so there's more than one gospel. Now, knowing that the word gospel simply means good news. So whatever that good news was, without it being defined or described unless you follow and read the teachings and the writings of the people who are promoting that view. So even Paul recognized there were people along in his day who were saying, well, there's more than one version of the truth. Don't have a problem with that. And I read that a German scholar by the name of, I believe it was Walter Bauer, wrote back after the beginning of last century. He was a scholar, that he wrote a work that was produced in, I think, 1930 or 1934, that really raised the specter that we don't have sufficient reliable evidence to believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote those Gospels, that Paul wrote the letters that we have under his name, that James and John wrote theirs, that Jude wrote his, that John wrote Revelation, that we simply don't have enough evidence to believe those things are true. And we have good evidence to believe they're not true. And most of us didn't hear anything about that quest because it wasn't until 1971 or 1970 when it was translated into English. And when it's translated to English, then Western civilization, Western culture became exposed to it. And one of those who was exposed to that theory of Reconstructionism was Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman was raised as an Episcopal. That's the American version of Anglicanism. Supposedly he had some sort of conversion experience. I'm not sure what that looks like in the Episcopal Church. They don't talk about being born again or about a new birth. It's other things they're rather liturgical. He went off to Moody Bible Institute, got his doctorate, and went to work for a very high-profile and well-known New Testament scholar in Metzger, Bruce Metzger. And those of us who attended religious institutions back in the 70s, that was the textbook that we had, Bruce Metzger's. And so he worked with him for a number of years, and then he went off on his own. And when he was exposed to this Reconstructionism, he bought into it. And he essentially said, those things that I profess to believe true, those things that I preached and taught and wrote before I got a hold of this, I've concluded that I was wrong, and now I have the real truth. And the real truth is, none of that is true. Now, you've heard me talk about him. He's highly regarded in some academic circles. I'm not so given to what I've read and heard from him as being legitimate. But I'm speaking to this because of those people that were raised in an environment where they didn't know what was true. You didn't know what was true. And so if you become curious, if you become interested because of your encounter with somebody, something you've read or something you've seen, and you're sitting by yourself and you're asking the question, well, then what am I to believe? I have these friends over here who they call themselves evangelicals or born-again Christians, and they swear by the books in the Old Testament and the New Testament. These are, in fact, the Word of God, that God used these writers, that this is God-breathed, and they're reliable and trustworthy. And that they can be not just life transformative, but they can be eternity transformative. I have them. They're good people. I like them. They're moral. They're upright. They're friendly, all those kind of things. But I wasn't raised with what they were raised with, and I don't know that those things are true. And because I've been raised in a world that highly esteems academia and research, then I read the works of people on this end who seem to say that the people on this end are really just ignorant. They really don't know what they're talking about. They haven't done their own homework. They've not gone back and looked at the manuscript evidence. They've not gone back and looked at the historical evidence. And so on this end, there are those who say, you can't believe any of it. Because in fact, Reconstructionism says that during the first 2 centuries of Christianity, there were multiple Christian groups who all called themselves Christians, but they all had a different version of the gospel. And that what we have now, what has come down to us over these 2,000 years, is the result of the adage of to the winner goes the spoils. That the religious group that became the dominant religious group in the subsequent history of Christianity, in primarily the 2nd century and the 3rd century and the 4th century, that it was the church at Rome that became the winner. And by doing so, then their version of Christianity was the one that became our version of Christianity. And so they've ignored and denied the coexistence with these other Christian groups, which is the reason this book was recommended, and which I am about 2/3 of the way through. That it goes back, and you talk about research and footnotes. I mean, it is heavily documented, where scholars have gone back and examined all of those claims by the Reconstruction crowd and said there is good reason to believe that what we know about the Gospels, what we know about the New Testament, what we know about Paul and the writers has a legitimate foundation as the evidence has been made known through written history. And so if you're one of those people that you really are curious, you really are uncertain as to what that looks like, how are you to know what to believe? Because one of the things that I have argued, and it is an argument, I'm capable of debating, but I'm more given to arguing, for those people who want to elevate Bart Ehrman as the prophet of this age that knows all truth. He's the embodiment of all truth, and he knows more than anybody else on the planet, so therefore his conclusions are the only legitimate conclusion. That my response is that unless you were there in 1st century Christianity, unless you were present in second century Christianity, unless you were present and as a witness of the people who did what they did, who wrote what they wrote, who said what they said, you can't claim to know the absolute truth. And you might push back and say, well, neither do you. I agree. I agree. And so this is my challenge, and this is one of the things that that I've witnessed and watched, and in the background, because I understand the academic arguments, I understand the history of dating documents and manuscripts based on the style. You know, before there was a printing press, everything was hand done. That particularly like with the New Testament, the Greek characters have evolved in what they actually look like, how they were written over time. And so we know by going back and looking at documents that we have dates on, historical documents, then we can compare the quote biblical documents and the style of the Greek characters to know exactly when those were written. That's how that game is actually played. Or if you go back and sort of date the material that they were written on. So in the book that Coming to Faith through Dawkins that I shared with you a while back that I read, it's the account of people that weren't raised on the timeline here. They were down in the zero, and if the zero is in the middle, they're on the negative side, because not only were they not raised believing, they were raised believing against it. It was not true. It was lunacy. It was stupidity. And so the people who submitted their accounts in that book are people who came from definitely this end of the spectrum. And somewhere along the way, as they bought into, they subscribed into the Richard Dawkins, the militant atheist view of reality and truth, that they became suspicious for whatever reason, and at some point they picked up a Bible. And at some point they said, you know what, I just need to read it for myself. I hear what others say about it. I hear the pros and the cons and the yes and the no's and all this, citing of documentary evidence and manuscript evidence and all that kind of stuff and because they weren't there, they don't know if it was true or not. So I'm not going to argue about the shape and the form of the vessel. I want to know what's inside the vessel. Is there anything of merit there? And it's really curious is that as they became exposed to the content of the Scripture, shutting out the voices on both sides of the debate and argument, the yeas and the nays, the fors and the against, something happened in their journey to bring them to a place to say, I believe. And I think that's the real test of the validity of Scripture, the 66 books of the biblical canon as we know it, the Old Testament books, the New Testament books, and whether it's important to you as whether Mark wrote Mark or not is secondary. Or John wrote John, or Paul wrote Galatians, who we're talking about here. Paul's warning is, here's the gospel that I knew, that I encountered, I share it with you. And if somebody comes along and offers a substitute, just ignore them. It's accursed. There's one true gospel. And so if you're willing to simply separate yourself from all the voices in the room and all the supposed experts who were not there, they cannot say definitively this is true or that is true. They can say, well, it's my opinion based on the research that I've done. That means nothing to you or to me. On either side, for the pro-evangelical, born-again Christian who says, I stand on it, I die on it, it is the Word of God, God breathed, you can ignore them too. My encouragement is to take it. I would encourage you primarily to start in the New Testament and begin reading there, and do it with a completely open mind. Say, I'm just going to read it for the information's sake. I want to read the names, and I want to read the places, and I want to read the storyline, and I want to read about the events, and I'm going to read and just see where that takes me. And I, for one, as somebody who does this and has been doing this for a long time, I'm okay leaving that to you if you're willing to, in all honesty, take that neutral approach and at least go in and examine the content. Don't, it's in, the saying, you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge truth by its packaging. What a box looks like doesn't really tell you what's inside that box. And all the opinions about the Bible are not going to tell you what you need to know about the Bible. So my encouragement to you is just simply shut it out and go, I don't know who to believe or what to believe, so I'm just going to read it for myself and see what my conclusion is. And then based on that is let your sense of what you need to do with that information lead you to seek out those that you feel are reliable to give you answers to that. Here's the other thing I want to do as my time is expiring is if you're one of those who has watched my deconstruction and now my reconstruction video in the past and you're one of those that is somewhere, down here in that spectrum of things. If you're someone who was raised in a faith system and you felt like you deconstructed and you walked away, I would love to hear from you, because I would love to do a Zoom video with you and just pick your brain. I want to know what you think and what you process and how you arrived at your conclusion. It's not an attack or an assault, and I'm not interested in twisting. I just want to know your story. And I would love to other people to hear your story. And then certainly if you're one of those who has been through that whole process, whether you started out knowing nothing, believing nothing, or start out believing what you were told by your parents and your grandparents and the culture we're in, and you walked away as well, you became disconcerted with that, disillusioned with that, and you walked away, but then something happened along the way, and you turned around, and you came back to that position of faith in Jesus Christ as God's payment for sin, as the promised Messiah, the one who died on the cross and came back to life. And now you are embracing that position once again. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me at this email address, or send a comment to me on either a Facebook page or YouTube, if that happens to be where you're watching this, because I want to hear from you. I would really love to be able to arrange a Zoom interview with you too, because I want to hear your story. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than to interact with people that are different from me, have a different story from mine, have come from a different place, so that you can help the rest of those around who are on that same journey wondering what is true and what is not true. So there you have it. We have gone from construction to deconstruction to reconstruction, and here we are back at construction. I do want to hear from you, and write to me at this email address and let me know how I can further encourage you along the way. And then share this with others so they can join us in this journey. And then for those of you who contribute financially to our ministry so that we can do what we do, I thank you for that. There are ways to do that electronically, and if you need help with that, just let me know. But if you're old school and simply want to drop a check in the mail, you can make it out to Church Rebirth Ministries Incorporated at this mailing address. We are a 501c3 organization, which makes your gift a charitable contribution and tax deductible. So thank you for joining me in this journaling process as I work through and as I continue to read and explore and understand and learn, not just from myself, from books, but also from you. I look forward to what next week holds for all of us.